Professor Perelli-Harris, when you were getting ready to write this paper with your colleague, Professor Gerber, what were the kind of issues that were circulating in the academic world? What led you to think about this subject, and what was your question that you were trying to answer by writing the paper?
Well, I started off with a very keen interest in Russia and Ukraine, the former Soviet Union. So my earlier work was more on low fertility, the decline to very low fertility in Ukraine and Russia, which was the lowest fertility rates in the world at the time. And then I moved on to non-marital fertility because that was increasing as well, and it was another massive change that was occurring in this region, and it was unprecedented. And Russia was going through a lot of economic uncertainty after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and so we didn't really know whether or not it was the less educated who were practicing this new behavior of having births within cohabitation, or whether or not it was the more highly educated people who were, and that would have been proposed by the second demographic transition, that it's the highly educated people who are rejecting the institution of marriage and rejecting patriarchy. So there was this debate that was evolving about whether or not the second demographic transition was occurring in Russia at all, and this piece fit into it because we didn't know whether or not the non-marital fertility was going to look more like the second demographic transition, or if in fact it was much more like the US patterns, because a lot of the research in the US showed that people who cohabited and people who had births outside of marriage were often low income. So Russia was this interesting case that kind of sat in between these two different debates, and we found evidence that was very clearly this pattern of disadvantage in Russia.
You also made a distinction between people who were single, really single, and people who were unmarried but living in cohabiting unions. How did that relate to your theoretical distinctions, to the theory of what you were doing?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question, because we did expect that people who were single, women who were single, would be low educated, because that's a pattern that's existed for a very, very long time. But the new phenomenon was this increase in cohabitation and people living together without getting married. And so we didn't know whether or not this new phenomenon was a rejection of the institution of marriage, or if it was people who couldn't afford to get married, or they had uncertain lives and economic uncertainty, which was very much tied up in living together but not getting married.
You had a co-author on this paper, so obviously you were talking to somebody. Did the two of you come to this from different points of view, or were you working together on the previous research? How did you get together with your co-author, and what other kind of contexts were you involved in during the creation of this paper? Did this paper get a lot of preliminary work in seminars and meetings and conferences and things, or did you just do this on your own, or how did it emerge?
Well, I was working with my postdoc supervisor, Ted Gerber, who was an expert on Russia, and he was also interested in what was going on in this particular region of the world. And he and I pretty much saw eye to eye with the idea that it could be the pattern of disadvantage. But what was interesting is that I presented the paper in Moscow to the Higher School of Economics, and the Russian demographers really thought that the second demographic transition was happening, and they explained it from this perspective of modernization, and that Russia was finally moving over into the
convergence with the West.
Yes, and so, but they tended to be, I want to say, more. They did a lot of rhetorical work or ideologically based work without actually doing the analyses of the finding the evidence. So they were a little bit reluctant to believe this pattern of disadvantage. And so I had some very interesting conversations with my Russian colleagues. Yeah.
And so this was written just to show them, in a way. I'll show you.
But it was also to challenge the second demographic transition. Mm-hmm. And I was very aware of these debates, and I was very skeptical that the underlying values as proposed by Ron Lestaga and Dirk Vanica were actually what was driving the increase in the second demographic transition.
In looking at the paper, I noticed one thing that you didn't say very much about in the paper, but that struck me from looking at the figures, was that the marital fertility that you showed in the figure was higher among the more educated women and lower among the less educated women. If I read the figure, maybe I read the figure wrong, but that's it. The single birth rates and the cohabiting birth rates were going along the bottom of the graph.
Yeah.
And they went up a little bit, but not a whole lot. And the marital fertility was way higher, but the marital fertility of the more educated women was way up high and fell a lot. And the marital fertility of the less educated women was lower and didn't fall as much. And I wonder if that was anything that was a part of what you were thinking about at this point, or is that just something going on in the article separate from your attention to the non-marital childbearing?
Well, I mean, the fertility was declining for everybody.
Yes.
I think to extremely low levels. And so, if I recall, it was a long time ago.
Yeah, that's the trouble with these. Yeah.
That the marital, I'm not surprised that the marital fertility for the more highly educated would have been a little bit higher because of the economic conditions that were going on. But it was also a little bit complicated because of the postponement of first births, and there wasn't much postponement of first births, but the more highly educated would have been postponing their first birth. So I can't remember exactly if it was after the point of union in this particular paper that you're seeing these transitions, and it could be that it was faster among the more highly educated because they had already postponed marriage, while the less educated had not postponed marriage.
Yeah, because the union status is a time-varying covariate in your analysis, and so once they switch over into the married category, they're older, and so hurry up,
Yeah.
and the more educated ones are even older still.
Right.
So
exactly.
that could be just an age thing.
Yeah.
Okay. What have you heard about this paper since it came out? What was the reaction to it among your colleagues and just in general?
Well, what happened was that I was at the University of Wisconsin at the time, and I started looking around at other European analyses to see if I could find anybody who had looked at the educational gradient of childbearing within cohabitation, and lo and behold, nobody had.
Right.
And I talked to Betty Thompson, and she said that this hadn't been done in Sweden. So I ended up moving to the Max Planck Institute, and there I set up what I call the Nonmarital Childbearing Network, and I found colleagues in lots of different countries who had been studying cohabitation or they'd been studying non-marital childbearing, but we hadn't put all of the elements together to look at whether or not this is a more universal phenomenon. And we found that there was actually a negative educational gradient in places like Sweden or Norway. Certainly there wasn't one in the UK, but that's very similar to the US. So it was much more of a common phenomenon than we had expected. I think that Ron Lestage and other proponents of the second demographic transition theory were a bit up in arms about this. And we had lots of debates, Ron and I, very friendly debates about what was going on. And I think that he was still very skeptical because he still sees that the second demographic transition is a new phenomenon and it's not one that's indigenous, because the indigenous fertility patterns had been there for a long time, and he makes this argument in Latin America too, that non-marital fertility, even within cohabiting unions, had been there for a long time among the least educated, but he was arguing that this is a new phenomenon, and it is a bit odd because you have to remember that childbearing within cohabitation is increasing in all countries at all educational levels. It's just that the least educated are much more likely to practice the behavior than the most highly educated. So in Norway, it was surprising because 40% of births were outside of marriage at the time, and yet the educational gradient was quite negative. So it's not as if some highly educated people are not practicing the behavior. it's occurring at all educational levels. So that was kind of his reaction to the paper. But I think that it really shook up this idea of the second demographic.
As a bunch of elites.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah, what struck me about that marital fertility thing was that looked like a pattern of disadvantage too, but from a very different point of view, that the married, less educated women might be having less children because they're disadvantaged. Less children could be a sign of disadvantage in some context.
Yeah, I mean, it goes both ways, because the very, very low educated who are on the margins of society, they would tend to have more children. But in Russia, education levels were actually quite high because it was a very educated society in general. So it was the people kind of caught in the middle who couldn't afford to have another child.
Okay.
Right. So that was there. That's why the total fertility rate fell so dramatically during that period.
That's right.
Is because people weren't having second births.
And throughout the reason.
Yeah, right. So there was some postponement, not a lot of postponement, but that could explain overall why you might have seen the lower educated or the middle educated not having as many births as the more
But it
high
could have been a timing thing too, as you were just pointing out.
Right.
Okay, well, we can't wait to find out what you do next. Thank you for this interview.
Thank you.